everyone. Welcome to the February 28th edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona, and I'll be flying solo this week. Craig had something come up last minute, so I'll be going through all of these races by myself. So the bad news is you only get to hear my voice on this podcast, but the good news is I think I'll have plenty to talk about because we've got an interesting set of races this week. I'll begin by talking about the Saudi Cup, which is taking place at about noon tomorrow on Saturday, and then we'll move over to Gulfstream Park, where I'll just stay for the rest of the show. We'll discuss 6 races from there, topped by the Fountain of Youth, which is the feature on that card. It's the major Derby prep this week, but I'll discuss the 4 stakes leading up to that as well as one of the earlier undercard stakes races. But we're going to begin by looking at that aforementioned Saudi Cup. Now, I know this is a race that plenty of people have a lot of mixed feelings about for a lot of reasons, from a wagering standpoint, just from a political standpoint. I'm not endorsing the race or endorsing anybody's participation in the race, but I will say that it's a race that is happening. So we're going to talk about it. And there's a lot of American interest in the race because you've got some of the top American horses running in this race from last year. A lot of them are getting their 20 campaigns started here. We'll begin, I guess, by talking about the 2 favorites, which are likely to be Maximum Security and McKinsey. And I think for Maximum Security, the big question for him is how the pace of this race is ultimately going to shake out, because you've got a couple of speeds among the foreign trained horses. The Americans that came over, they're not really speed types, but in particular, North America is coming over from Dubai, as well as Capizano is coming from that same part of the world. They both have plenty of speed. If you watch their races at Meydan recently, North America's Need the Lead type, who just gets ridden to the front in all of his races there and tries to open up as much as he can around the far turn into the stretch of those races. And Capizano is really more of a miler type who, same as North America, tries to use his speed to his advantage in those races. Now, Maximum Security, he's not a need the lead type of horse. He can stalk the pace effectively. We saw that in the Haskell last year when he took over and beat today's rival Mucho Gusto. But he might be a little bit better with the early lead. That's the way he usually likes to run. And I think the other major question for Maximum Security is that Cigar Mile last time a true gauge of where he's at right now? Because he was very impressive beating Spun to Run that day, but it is worth remembering that December 7th card at Aqueduct featured a moderate speed bias. I don't think the rail was the place to be. I didn't see it as a rail bias, but speed definitely had a slight advantage. We didn't see a whole lot of horses closing from the back of the pack that day, so Maximum Security was definitely with the track profile on that occasion. I like him in this spot. I think 1 1/8 is a perfect distance for him. I'm definitely using him. I just think his main rival, McKinsey, might have the upper hand this time. Again, the distance is going to be perfect for this horse because the big problem with McKinsey last year was that 1 1/4 just is always a little bit too far for him. That really was exposed in the Breeders' Cup Classic when he just could not contain that late surge from Vino Rosso in the stretch of that race. I thought McKinsey ran really well in the Breeders' Cup. He just ran well as well as he could going that 1 1/4 distance. Prior to that, I don't really have an excuse for the awesome again, but I guess every horse, even the best horses in the country, deserve to have an off day once in a while. And I'm willing to give him that because prior to those 2 performances, he was on quite a tear. Those 3 races that he ran, from the Ali Sheba to the Met to the Whitney, are 3 of the best performances put forth by any horse in all of 2019. And I think if we see that version of McKinsey show up in Saudi Arabia on Saturday, he's just not going to be beaten, because I don't think Maximum Security has attained that level quite yet. He's gotten close, but I think Maximum Security even has to improve on his Cigar Mile to get to the kind of form that we saw at McKinsey, let's say, in his Whitney win. And that Whitney win came going 9 furlongs, and it also came out of town. And I think it's worth pointing out with McKinsey that it's worth entertaining the idea that Santa Anita, which is his home base, might not be his favorite surface, because the 3 times that he shipped last year were the 3 best performances he put forth. So he's shipping again. We'll see if this dirt track at King Abdulaziz racetrack is to his liking, but he seems to handle any type of going away from California. So I just think McKinsey is going to work out the right kind of trip at the right distance, and he might just be the best horse in the race. He also appears to be training great. If you watch some of his recent workouts, he just looks like a monster out there in the mornings. So I am very afraid of McKinsey in this race, and I'd make him my top pick. As for the other Americans, they're going to be slightly bigger prices. The one horse that probably shouldn't get ignored, and he's 15-1 on the international morning line for whatever that means. I don't think he's going to be as big of a price as that. But the number 12 Tacitus, who is drawn in post position 2 here, is a horse that I don't want to totally ignore. He definitely went slightly off form at the end of 2019. It's hard to love too much about his performance in the Jockey Club Gold Cup because he did get a good trip that day and just really had no answer for Code of Honor and Vino Rosso in the late stages. hatches. But he's now coming off a layoff, and this is the kind of horse that I think anybody who followed his 2019 season always thought might be better as a 4-year-old. He's got that kind of pedigree that says he's going to keep getting better with age by Tappet out of the damn close hatches, who herself was an excellent 4-year-old. So I just feel like Tacitus might have more to say as he starts to get a little bit older with more experience and maturity. I'll be interested to see what kind of tactics they employ here, because he was much more aggressive in his last 2 starts of last year when they added the blinkers to his equipment. He was surprisingly on the lead early in the Travers, and then even last time in the Jockey Club Gold Cup, he was racing very keenly under Jose Ortiz, pressing the pace of that race. He's obviously not going to be on the lead here because there's just a lot more speed in this race with Maximum Security and those 2 speeds that I mentioned coming from Dubai. So Tacitus will have to revert to closing tactics. I think it's just a question of how far off the pace he's going to be early. And I think you can ask a similar question of a horse like Midnight Bisou. She is the one of 2 fillies in this field, or mares, I should say. She's the one who seems to have the much better chance, since the other one, Magic Wand, is really more of a turf horse. Midnight Bisou, I'm a fan. She just gives an honest effort every time. She's got a nose for the wire. She's so game in her races. Is she as good as the best male horses in the country? I tend to say no, but she's not that far behind. I mean, she's run some speed figures that at least put her in the mix of this grade 1 level. I don't think she's going to be competitive with the best efforts that we see from Maximum Security and McKinsey if they do show up with their top performances. But I'm not going to be shocked if she gets a piece of this. If she is closing for 3rd, I don't think that should be viewed as a big surprise here, because, again, 9 furlongs is the best distance for her. It seems that there's a bit of pace in this race, and she's, like McKinsey, is not a horse that has to carry her racetrack around with her. She just runs well everywhere. She appears to be trading well off the layout for Steve Asmussen. So I'm not going to totally throw out Midnight Bisou. I just don't think she's really a win candidate from my perspective. As for the others, you're mostly looking at international contenders coming from other countries. I think they're all a little bit up against it. A lot of people might be interested in a horse like Ben Battle, who was visually impressive, winning the Maktoum Challenge Round 2 at Meydan last time in what I believe was a track record performance, going 1 mile and 3/16 there. So he handled a similar distance on dirt, but it was a different kind of dirt track. Also, Christophe Soumillon kept him totally out of the kickback that day, which I think was really to his benefit. So we don't know if this horse can run through kickback, which is really, I think, one of the big obstacles to turf horses running on the dirt for the first time. He did not overcome that adversity last time, and it's not like he's going to have a chance to do that in this race, because he doesn't have that much speed. So he was stalking a slow pace last time. I don't think the pace of this race is going to be nearly that slow. So I'm just not totally convinced that Ben Battle can reproduce that kind of effort against top competition, or that he's really a dirt horse. I mean, the horses that I think would be more convincing coming in from other countries are the 2 Japanese horses. Chris O'Barrel is the one that's going to attract most of the attention because he's undefeated in 6 starts. He only beat Gold Dream, though, by a neck last time in the Champions Cup at Chukyo. And Gold Dream, I know he's not this win machine like Chris O'Barrel is, but he's really consistent, and he always puts forth an honest effort. He can get 1 mile and 1/8. Again, maybe he's losing a step as a 7-year-old, and you could say that his last effort wasn't his best, but he's going to be a much bigger price than Chris O'Barrel. So I would take a look at both of these horses if you're playing exotics. Again, I think it's going to be really tough for any of these international contenders to beat the 2 best Americans, which I believe are McKinsey and Maximum Security. I'm realizing I forgot to mention one horse. That would be the Pegasus World Cup winner, Mucho Gusto. Not a big fan of his. I'll talk about the Pegasus World Cup a little bit later when we get to the Gulfstream Park Mile, but I just thought that was not the strongest grade 1 race, and I think Mucho Gusto is facing much better company in this Saudi Cup. Let's move on to that Gulfstream Park card and discuss some of these stakes races that are taking place there on Saturday. And I'll begin with one of the earlier races of the day. It's the 5th race, the Grade 3 Honey Fox, going 1 mile on the turf for the fillies and mares. And an interesting crew was signed on for this race. I think a lot of the focus will be towards the outside, because you've got the number 11 Valedictorian, who's the slight favorite on the morning line. And it's hard to knock this mare. She just seems to show up in most of her races. She did go slightly off form at the end of 2019. She put forth an uncharacteristically dull effort in the Noble Damsel last time. But prior to that, she had just been a picture of consistency. She showed, going all the way back to last winter and the early springtime, that she absolutely loves this Gulfstream Park turf course. It's just a matter of how fit she is off the layoff, how much pace pressure she's going to get early in this race, and just really whether anybody else can step up, because she's run the fastest speed figure figures, and the others just have to improve a little bit to get on terms with her. I'm using her. She's not going to be any kind of big price, though, and I think there are some others in this race that might get a little bit ignored on the tote board that are pretty interesting. You have to discuss a few of the horses coming out of the South Beach Stakes on January 25th. Atomic Blonde got the win that day, and she's one of the favorites here. I'm not the biggest fan of Atomic Blonde. I thought she got very lucky to win that race. The trip really worked out for her, whereas it did not for a lot of other horses in that South Beach. I don't think she's going to be quite as fortunate this time, and she's also facing some better horses because you've got Valedictorian. You've even got a horse like Munchkin Money, who's a nice class horse. She was second to Magic Star in the Marshuas River last time. So I think both of those are formidable runners with proven class at this graded stakes level that I just don't know if Atomic Blonde has proven that she's quite on terms with them yet. But I am interested at bigger prices in some other horses coming out of that South Beach. One of those would be Conquest Hard Candy, who just lost all chance at the start of that race. Two horses really blew the break of that South Beach. One was Mitchell Road, who actually came on well to be second, but the one who really took the worst of it was Conquest Hard Candy. She's a horse who wants to be up close to the pacer on the lead, and she just broke slowly, was steady back after that. It took a while for Edgar Zayas to really get a feel for her, and she was just completely out of the race. I would draw a line through it. Going back to 2019, she ran some races that put her right in the mix here, because that fifth place finish by only 3/4 of a length in the Ballston Spa, that was arguably the best effort of her career. I mean, she was not that far behind horses like Significant Form, Indian Blessing, and Starship Jubilee, all of whom would probably be favored over a horse like Valedictorian in this race. She is coming off a poor effort too back in the First Lady. I don't really care about that race because the pace of that race was just ridiculously fast. She got involved in an early duel. It completely fell apart for Uni to come from way back that day. So I don't really mind that Conquest Hard Candy didn't run that well in that spot. Now this time out, the TimeformUS pace projector is predicting a fast pace, and I could see it being honest up front because Valedictorian wants to be forward. You've got Silver Kitten from the rail, who's been in some slower paced races, but she does want to be gunning for the front end, I would suppose. Conquest Hard Candy, she's another one who wants to be forwardly placed, but she's not a need the lead type. So I think she'll get a stalking trip here, and at a very big price. She's 10-1 on the morning line. I think she's a horse that you can consider. My top pick in this race, though, would be a horse who's an even bigger price on the morning line. That's the number 7, Get Mother a Rose. And if you watch the Horses to Watch segment that I do on DRFTV, where I highlight horses' trips every week, you'll notice that I highlighted this horse's last trip in the South Beach because I really thought she ran well that day at 21-1 and might not get the credit that she deserves for that performance because she was breaking from an outside post position that day. Rosario was trying to get her into position early, but she ended up going a little bit wide into the first turn. That was a race that was completely dominated by horses that were riding the rail, one of those being the winner, Atomic Blonde. And Gut Mother of Rose was just 3 to 4 wide for the entire race. Rosario had to make this premature 4-wide move with her coming around the far turn. And she actually got up on even terms with the leaders by about the 3/16 pole. She just understandably flattened out after that because of all those early exertions, losing ground around the far turn. Prior to that, I know that her form doesn't quite look as good as some of the others in here, but she was really starting to improve last season for Tom Bush. She was very visually impressive in that 6-furlong allowance win at Aqueduct back in November. She's got to get the mile. That's a concern because she hasn't done it successfully in the past. I just feel like she's a different horse now than she was even 6 months ago. So I want to evaluate her just off her last 2 efforts. And she just seems like the now horse that could be heading in the right direction. Junior Alvarado hasn't ridden her before, but he's been riding very well this winter. And I think he could work out the right trip for her if there is some pace in this race. So looking to light up the tote board in the Honey Fox with Get Mother a Rose, who is 15-1 on the morning line. Let's now move on to the stakes races happening later in the card at Gulfstream Park on Saturday, and we'll just go right through to the end from the 10th through the 14th race, the final 5 races on this card, which are all stakes events, graded stakes events. Let's begin with the Davona Dale, the Grade 2 Kentucky Oaks prep for the 3-year-old fillies, going 1 mile on the dirt. And a lot of focus in this race is going to be on the 2 favorites, those being the number 6 Spice is Nice and the number 9 Tonalist Shape. Sorry that I can't talk about this race with Craig because I assume that we both would have had the same opinion here. I know that we've both been looking forward to betting against Tonalist Shape because she's a horse who has been visually impressive in her wins. She hasn't been beating the toughest fields, though. And on the morning line, I see she's a much bigger price than Spice is Nice. We'll see how they bet this race. I didn't see these two as being that far apart in the odds. But if Tonalist Shape is the second choice in here, if she's taking any kind of money, she's just a horse that I want to try to get out of the exacta or trifecta in this race. Because, like I said, she did get that graded stakes win in the Forward Gal last time. Take a look at that field. I mean, you see the first-time starter, Nikki and Papa, was third in that race with the kind of speed figure that's not going to win most maiden races at Gulfstream. So Tonalist Shape, to me, just looks a little bit slow. I know she's got a big buyer, too, back in the Hut. That's a race that's a little difficult to make a speed figure for. The TimeformUS number is much lower and does not make her competitive with a horse like Spice is Nice. So I'm just somewhat against Tonalist Shape in this race, and I think there are more appealing horses at better odds. A horse who's not going to be a big price, though, is the likely favorite Spice is Nice. I don't want to be hard on her. I don't like to endorse short prices. I just think it's hard to pick against Spice is Nice in this race because her debut was really something to behold. You don't see first-time starters winning going a mile as impressively and professionally as she did back in January. She didn't even break that well that day. It's hard to evaluate who actually breaks slowly in these starts at Gulfstream Park because you only get the head-on shot of them. But she obviously broke about a length slowly, got squeezed back, was in behind horses, taking kickback for the early part of that race. And she just squeezed through this tight opening on the rail on the far turn, took over easily. And once she made the lead, she kind of pricked her ears, shut things down a bit for John Velasquez until he asked her at the top of the stretch. And once he got into her, she just took off, decimated that field, won by 12 lengths. I mean, she was no surprise. They knew she was bet down to even money that day. The speed figure came back as a 108 on the TimeformUS scale, an 84 buyer. Those numbers are just pretty much significantly higher, 10 points or so higher than anybody else in this race has run. Now, you could say that the horses behind her weren't much. The runner-up Jeweled Princess came back to disappoint, I believe, as the even money choice in a much weaker maiden race at Gulfstream recently. Some of the others haven't distinguished themselves, but I don't know how much it matters that she wasn't beating top competition when she's winning by 12 lengths because she was just in a different class than those horses. Spice is Nice to me. She looks like the real deal. I'm not taking a big stand against her in multi-race bets. I would definitely be using her as the only A. Just looking at some others in here, I'm not going to be so against Bayerness, who might be the third choice in this race. I think she makes some sense. She's undefeated, obviously. I thought she ran really well and was game to get by Swiss Skydiver in that allowance race at Churchill Downs last time. She was running over a sloppy track that day, but she had also run well in her debut over dry going. And Swiss Skydiver, frankly, looked like she had that race won coming down to the final 16th, and Bayerness just kicked it into another gear, got her in the late stages. It wasn't like they were walking home that final eighth of a mile. Bayerness just accelerated to beat her. So I think she's a horse that definitely gets this mile distance. It's just a question of quality with her and whether she can improve to run as fast as Spice is Nice did in her debut. The one other horse that I would mention at a big price, not necessarily a win candidate, but a horse that I would try to get in there for exotics, is the number 5, Reluctant Bride, for Patrick Biancone. Biancone just seems to have a knack for these turf to dirt moves lately. He's done it with Diamond Oops. He did it with Sol Volante. He's done it successfully with Ete Indian, who we'll talk about a little bit later in the Fountain of Youth. And Reluctant Bride, she's never run on dirt, but she certainly has a pedigree that suggests she should be fine over it because her damn sassy image was a multiple grade 1 winner on the dirt. I believe she won the Humana Distaff and the Princess Rooney, but she could even go as far as a mile and a 16th. I think she also was winner of the Goldenrod, going that distance as a 2-year-old. So it really is more of a dirt family on the female side. She's by Speightstown, which obviously he goes either way as a sire. He's quite versatile. So Reluctant Bride, she's going to have to run a lot faster than she ever has on the turf, but maybe this turf to dirt move could work out once again for Patrick Biancone. Let's move on to the next race on the card at Gulfstream Park, which is the Grade 3 Canadian Turf, going 1 mile for the older horses. And this one just seems like a real crapshoot. You've got a lot of contenders. They're difficult to separate. It's no surprise to me that the morning line favorite is as high as 4-1 because it seems like any favorite in this race is going to be pretty lukewarm. That favorite is Hey Dakota, who's drawn the rail here. And you've got 2 horses coming out of that optional claiming race last time that was won by Hey Dakota, he and Sambaye, who was second to him that day. I don't know if I really think of these horses as graded stakes level. Hey Dakota definitely is in career form right now for Jason Service, but he got an absolutely perfect trip last time to win that race. Irad Ortiz just made all the right moves. He got plenty of pace ahead of him. He could found the right seams to run through at the right time, and he squeezed through this tight opening at about the eighth pole to get by Sambier at the end of that race. Frankly, Sambier might have run the better race because he was chasing a pretty honest pace the entire way. It was really game once Hey Dakota came to him at the end of that race. The problem for Sambier is he could face a difficult task again because you've got some other speeds in this race. So he's going to have to work out that stalking chasing trip that's not so easy on the turf. Hey Dakota, I'll use him. I mean, I think you have to be a little fearful of anything Jason Service sends out, especially when they seem to be heading in the right direction like this horse is. I just want to look in another direction for some better value. Got a couple horses coming out of that Tampa Bay Stakes that didn't do so well. Hembry and Caribou Club, who finished sixth and seventh respectively. That was a weird race. Neither of these showed up with their top efforts that day. Admiralty Pier, Devamani, and March to the Arch, who were the top three finishers that day. I think it's interesting when you watch that Tampa Bay Stakes back to note that those top three finishers, they were the three horses that rode the rail for the entire race. And we see that phenomenon on turf a lot, where the rail is just such an advantage, and the horses that save ground down there typically do the best. Caribou Club was about 2 to 3 wide throughout. Hembry was wider than that, 3 wide around the far turn, got spun out widest of all into the stretch. So maybe their trips didn't work out for them. The performances were poor, don't get me wrong, but I'm going to kind of forgive them for those races because the prior form for each of these horses make them real contenders and arguably more appealing than a horse like Hey Dakota. And if the pace really does heat up on the front end, Hembry might be the horse you want because he can get the 1 mile distance. He's been successful at Gulfstream Park before, and he just has this really awesome late kick when it sets up right for him. So I'll use Hembry. He's one of my top picks in this race. The horse, though, that I would make my top selection is the number 9, Guidou. Guidou is a really difficult horse for me to assess. I feel like I keep going back and forth about whether I think he's a sprinting 1-turn horse or whether I think he's best as a 2-turn miling type. I'm now leaning towards the latter camp based on his last race. It does seem like he's more effective around 2 turns these days, probably because the paces are a little bit more relaxed. He didn't get anything easy on the front end, though, last time when he contested that Tropical Turf Stakes going a mile, the same distance as today, because he had Gemontier outside of him that day, and Gemontier is back in this race. They were going a pretty fast pace up front, and Guidou was in that difficult position where he's inside of another speed horse, about a half length back, racing keenly, kind of in an awkward position. But to his credit, he did not get discouraged. He came through inside of that horse around the far turn, took it over at the top of the stretch, and just got run over by Tusk, who is one of those Saffy Josie miracle jobs, who just seems to be in the better form than he ever has been off the trainer switch to that barn. But Guidou ran a winning race to be second that day. He earned a 1:19 TimeformUS speed figure, bumped up because of that fast pace that he was contesting. So a repeat of that kind of number, I think, is going to make him difficult for horses like Hey Dakota or Hembry or even Caribou Club to catch. I like that he's drawn outside of Gemontier this time because he's shown that he can stalk the pace last time, and this time he might get the stalk outside, which I think is more advantageous. And I just think he might work out a better trip, and he's arguably the most talented horse in the race. Guidou is hard to trust, but if he's around that 8-1 morning line or even in that 6-1 to 8-1 range, I think that's a very fair price on him. So he would be my top pick in the Canadian turf. Next up at Gulfstream Park is the 12th race, the Gulfstream Park Mile, another Grade 2 event going a mile on the dirt course. And this one is pretty competitive. I'll be interested to see how they bet this race because you've got a favorite, Mr. Freeze, who, if you just look at it at first glance, you might think that he is way faster than this field, way classier than this field, cutting back to the right distance, just makes a ton of sense, deserves to be significantly bet down off that 7-2 morning line, which seems like wishful thinking to me. I imagine he's going to be much closer to about that 2-1 range, or perhaps even lower than that, based on his runner-up finish to Mucho Gusto in the Pegasus World Cup Invitational last time. Mr. Freeze is a good horse. Don't get me wrong. I just feel like he's been in some spots that look pretty good, a couple of Grade 1 events where he was second and third. Those races, though, didn't feature the toughest competition. The Pegasus World Cup that we saw last month one of the weaker editions of that race. I mean, the only horse of significance that he really beat that ran anything was War Story, because Mucho Gusto was just the dominant winner of that race. Prior to that, Mr. Freeze was distant third behind Tom's Tata, beaten by a similar margin prior to that in the Fayette Stakes when he was second to that same horse. He earned some impressive speed figures, and he did well in those races. I don't get the sense that he's significantly faster than some of his competitors in this race. And while I do like him getting back to the 1 mile distance, he ran fine going the mile and 1/8, and he actually got some more favorable pace setups in those mile and 1/8 races. So I don't think it's some guarantee that the mile is necessarily going to be better for him, because there is quite a bit of pace in this race. And I don't think it's any surprise to see the TimeformUS pace projector is predicting a fast pace, because you've got a horse like Zendin in here, the number 8 Rare Form. They were both towards the front end in the Fred Hooper last time, and that Fred Hooper featured a very fast pace, which helped to set it up for the winner of that race, Fat Man. I don't really want any of the horses coming out of the Fred Hooper. I mean, Fat Man is the horse you really want to be against, because he got a perfect setup that day closing into that fast pace. I guess Zendin is the run that ran the best that day, because he was able to hold on for a second after putting away all of the other speeds. It's just, this is a significantly tougher spot than the Fred Hooper, so I want to look in some other directions, entertain some new faces in this race. One of those would definitely be True Timber, who is a very big price on the morning line. I don't think we're going to get 15-1 on this horse. If I did, I would have put him on top, because he's not a horse who should pay $32 to win in this race. True Timber is coming off a disappointing effort in the Pegasus World Cup last time, but 1 mile and 1/8 is just not the right distance for this horse. He is a one-turn specialist. He ran very well two back in the Cigar Mile when he was third behind Maximum Security and spun to run, breaking from the outside that day. He actually was one of the few horses that made up some ground in that race. He earned a speed figure of 119, which puts him right in the mix. Prior to that, he had earned speed figures in the 120s in races like the Bold Ruler and the Kelso. He wasn't winning those races, but he was finishing behind some really nice horses like Maximum Security and Prince Lucky. So I just think True Timber is going to love turning back to this one-turn mile, and makes a ton of sense from a class standpoint. So I'm definitely using him. As for the others that are new faces in this race, you also have Bodie Express coming out of the Pegasus. For me, the jury is still out about how good this horse really is. He couldn't run quite as well as Mr. Freeze last time. He might appreciate the cutback to 1 mile even more than that horse, but he's drawn inside here. He's done his best work when he has a clear early lead. I don't think he's getting it in this race, so I was kind of iffy on him. I'll use him more as an exotics type. If you want to go for some deep closers, you could look at a horse like High Call, who came back in an allowance race at Aqueduct last time. Couldn't quite get the job done, but he put a step in the right direction after finishing third in the Wood Memorial last year, winning the Gotham. I think he is a horse that likes this one-turn mile. He just has no early speed and is going to need a total pace collapse, as well as putting up by far the best speed figure of his career. I'd actually, at a bigger price, prefer a horse like Hog Creek Hustle on the outside. He was the winner of the Woody Stevens last year, almost got the job done in the Grade 1 H. Allen Jerkins after that. They ran out of 6 furlongs in each of his last 3 starts, and for me, 6 furlongs seems like it might be a little bit short for this horse. 7 furlongs, probably his best distance. I think the one-turn mile, though, is also ideal for him. So I would use Hog Creek Hustle here, though I want to go for a wacky horse as my top pick, and that would be the number 6 Expert. I have no idea how they're going to bet this horse. I don't know what kind of price he's going to be. I see the morning line maker installed him at 8-1. I could see him at 8-1. I could see him at 20-1, because I don't know if this is a horse that is going to be found appealing by many of the fans, because he's coming off a very long layoff. He hasn't been seen since last May. All of his prior efforts that would make him competitive here, came for Linda Rice. Now he's switching into Dominic Scatino's barn off the layoff. He is a horse, though, that got really good last spring and going back to last winter. I mean, you look at that allowance race that he won back on April 6th over Blewett. Not the kind of competition he's going to face here, but he was very visually impressive that day. He came back and was so much the best in that April 27th optional claiming race. That was a day at Belmont Park where the rail was really the place to be. There was a significant inside bias. He overcame that, closed into a slow pace to get up to win going 7 furlongs, which is probably too short for him. And then next time out, he was running over a sloppy racetrack against Preservationist. He actually put up a really good fight against that horse. That was the race that Preservationist won right before going on to win the Suburban so impressively and ascending to heights in the Woodward later on in the year. So he was putting up a really good fight against a Grade 1 quality horse that day. Something obviously went wrong that's kept Expert off the racetrack for this amount of time. But if you watch some of his recent workouts on XBTV, it's apparent that this horse is training really well. Dominic Scatino, obviously hard to improve off the job that Linda Rice does, but Dominic Scatino has been having a very strong meet down at Gulfstream Park and has been doing really well down there for the past few years, actually, if you look up the stats in DRF Formulator. So I don't think this might be as negative of a trainer switch as some might perceive it to be. And Expert is going to get some pace in this race. Obviously, you want a price on him. I'm hoping for double-digit odds. We'll see if we get that. But he's just a weird horse that I have to take a shot with in a race like this because I thought he got so good late last year for the Prior Barn. Let's next move on to the race right before the Fountain of Youth, going back to the turf for the Mac Diarmida Grade 2 event, going 1 3/8 here for the turf marathoners, and a high-quality field on display here. The favorite is likely to be the number 6 Zulu Alpha, who was the winner of that prestigious Grade 1 Pegasus World Cup Turf Invitational last month. That was a race, though, we had talked about it prior. Again, kind of like the dirt race, it wasn't the strongest edition of the Pegasus World Cup Turf, certainly not as strong as the one that Bricks and Mortar won 2 years ago, or I should say last year. And Zulu Alpha, it was a race that he won because of the trip. And it was really a story of many different trips in that race. And Zulu Alpha got by far the best trip of anybody because he broke from the rail, was just on the rail for the entire way. It's like the Red Seas parted for Tyler Gaffalione between the horses off the rail and the inside fence at the top of the stretch. Zulu Alpha just shot on through that opening, won by 2 lengths. It was a decisive victory, but he had so much go right that day. I just can't take a horse coming back off that kind of trip because when you go to his form prior to that, during 2019, it was solid, but does that form make him a significant favorite over horses like Sadler's Joy and Channelmaker? I don't think it's supposed to. So for my money, he's going to be an underlay based on one performance where he had everything go right for him, and I don't trust that the same circumstances are going to present themselves on Saturday. The trip horse that I've got to take out to the Pegasus World Cup Turf Invitational is Sadler's Joy. I think I highlighted this horse also on my Horses to Watch segment. I mean, how could I not have? Because I love Sadler's Joy. He's just a horse that I'm a big fan of. He's got this really exciting late closing kick. He just never got to produce it in the Pegasus last time because if you watch the start of that race, he gets completely eliminated. I know that he's a closer that was probably going to be coming from the back of the pack anyway, but he lost a good 4 to 5 lengths of position at the start. In a top-level Grade 1 race like that, you can't give up that kind of ground, even if you are a closer. So I just think Sadler's Joy had all the worst of it that day. And even after that, he had to go so wide around the far turn when he was launching his run. So I'm going to evaluate Sadler's Joy based on his prior efforts. I thought he got back to his best form in the Red Smith 2-back. He wasn't beating the best rivals that day, but he was visually impressive doing it. And before that, he ran well without a great setup in the Turf Classic. He was a good second to Animals of Time and the Sword Dancer. He's just been a top-class horse for a while. He got back to his best form last year, and I just think Sadler's Joy is, in some ways, the horse to beat in this race because he likes Gulfstream Park, likes 1 3/8, and I think he's going to get a little bit of pace to close into here because you've got a thread of blue in the race, and personally, I don't think a thread of blue wants to go 1 3/8, so I imagine at some point a thread of blue is going to be coming back to this field a little bit. You've also got horses like Marzo, who could be pressing the pace, Channelmaker, who could be pressing the pace. I don't think they're going to be moving that fast up front, but I don't think it's a situation where there's a horse that's going to get totally loose on the lead and wire this field. So I think that's going to allow Sadler's Joy to get into the race and make his late run more effective. I wouldn't be against a horse like Channelmaker, the other class horse in this race. He had trouble winning races in 2019. They just timed it perfectly in that Man of War, and they just couldn't really repeat that feat after that, facing many similar rivals that he faced that day. But it's not like he ran that poorly until they got to the Breeders' Cup, where he just, couldn't put forth his best effort at Santa Anita. Getting back to Gulfstream Park, he's never run that well here before, and that's a concern for me. He seems to be more of a New York type of horse, but still, he likes this distance. He should work out a decent trip. He'll be the best price of these 3 major class horses, Sadler's Joy, Channelmaker, and Zulu Alpha, so I'm not going to totally discount his chances. But for me, it's mostly about Sadler's Joy getting his revenge for the Pegasus World Cup Turf in this Mac Diarmida on Saturday. And that brings us to the final race that we'll discuss on this podcast. It's that feature race on Saturday at Gulfstream Park, that Derby Prep, the Grade 2 Fountain of Youth going 1 mile in the 16th, that unique configuration where they had right into the clubhouse turn and have that short run to the first wire. 50 points on the line towards the winner, trying to qualify towards the Kentucky Derby. And I know some of the connections of these horses are getting a little bit apprehensive about whether they can get those points in this race, because there was a lot going on at the post position draw. The field swelled to 12 at the last minute. Some of the top contenders got stuck in outside post positions, like the number 10 Shotsky, the number 11 Ete Indian, and particularly the number 12 Chancet, who was just done no favors by this post position draw. I know his connections were wavering about whether or not to run in this race. It sounds like maybe they will run, but I think they're going to wait to make a race day decision about that. The main story in this race, though, is the morning line favorite, the number 5, Dennis's Moment. He is trying to get back to his best form from his 2-year-old season, and many do believe that if he does so, he's just going to win this race, because he was undeniably good last year. That maiden win at Ellis Park, when he won going 7 furlongs and 121 and change with a 116 TimeformUS speed figure, that was a seriously impressive performance. You just do not see 2-year-olds running that fast in July of their juvenile season. Not only did he get a 116 TimeformUS speed figure, the final time figure for that race was a 122, which is just crazy to think about, that a 2-year-old could run that fast going 7 furlongs in the summer of that season. He came back and tried 2 turns for the first time in the Iroquois. He wasn't as visually impressive, but he passed the test. He did everything that was asked of him. He beat a decent field. I mean, Scabbard is okay. Scabbard hasn't really gone on to do much since then. The third place finisher, Lebda, again, he disappointed against top company, but he came back recently and won a race at Laurel. I think it validates the speed figure that Dennis's Moment got in that Iroquois, which honestly wasn't that much lower than what he got in his maiden victory. So based on those 2 performances, Dennis's Moment is already fast enough to be winning Derby preps like this Fountain of Youth. It's just a question of, have any of the other competitors stepped up to rise to his level or even surpassed him in the 4 months that he's been away. Obviously, I'm not holding Dennis's Moment's Breeders' Cup against him. That was just a disastrous start, a disastrous trip after that. So he gets excuses for 2 of his 4 races. Based on his best efforts, he's way the horse to beat, but there are some legitimate competitors in this race and horses that do have a chance to beat him. And I think the 2 that you have to discuss as having the best chances are those 2 horses coming out of the Mucho Macho Man who photoed for the victory that day, those being the aforementioned Chancet, who's drawn out in that number 12 post position, and the number 6 As Seen on TV. Now, Chancet, if he runs in this race, the post it's a bummer because you want to see all of these horses have a fair chance. And there are plenty of horses with really no hope drawn to his inside who got much more favorable positions than he did. But that's the way the cookie crumbles for this horse. And if he runs on Saturday, he's unlikely to get an ideal trip. He might not need an ideal trip to get on the board here because he is a fast horse. I don't want to sell him short. He's run a number of races that make him faster than most of his rivals here, particularly last time in that Mucho Macho Man, where at first I thought that 99 Buyer and that 112 TimeformUS speed figure seemed too high for that field, but that's come back to be a totally legitimate race. Also rans have come back to validate that figure. The third place finisher Sol Volante came back to actually improve when he won the Sam F. Davis next time. So I think Chancet ran as well as it looks that day. He just got a good trip, though, coming up the rail. Everything worked out. He drifted out pretty badly at the end, and I think really did intimidate the runner-up as seen on TV. If I were a steward, and I'm not, I don't wish to be, but I think that would have been a situation where I would have said that As Seen on TV was cost the victory that day. As Seen on TV, though, regardless of what happened in the Mucho Macho Man, he's the horse more so than Chancet that I want going forward as they stretch out in distance, because contrary to what you might think looking at As Seen on TV's past performances, given how proficient he was sprinting early in his career, his pedigree actually says he wants to run all day because he's by looking at Lucky, who can get horses with serious stamina. And on the dam side, it's really all route pedigree. His dam never really got a chance to excel going longer, but she has foaled Cage Fighter, who was a stakes placed router. He was, I believe, second in the mile and eighth Knickerbocker, a grade 3 event on the turf. At Untamed Passion, this horse's dam, she's a half sister to Fantasticat, who was a winner of the 9 furlong Super Derby. They are both out of Lotta Dancing, who was a graded stakes winning dirt router for Shug McGahee a number of years ago, grade 1 place dirt router. So it's really all dirt route pedigree on the dam side for As Seen on TV. And maybe it should be no surprise that he stepped up and ran the best race of his career when they finally stretched it out to the mile last time in the Mucho Macho Man. He doesn't strike me as a horse that's going to have any problem with the mile and the 16th distance. He's drawn a much better post position than many of his main rivals in this race. Paco Lopez, likely to be aggressive. Don't think this horse needs the lead, but he should get a good stalking trip if he's not on the lead. And I just think, as seen on TV, makes a ton of sense. We'll see what price he is. We'll see if Chance It runs in this race. But if he's the second or third choice and is around that 4-1, 9-2 range, I'll be glad to take that kind of price on as seen on TV. And he's my top pick in this Fountain of Youth. As for the others, I mean, I would give a shot to horses like Shotsky and Ete Indian. They both are hindered by the post position draws. Ete Indian, I liked his race last time in the Holy Ball. I just don't think he's going to get the same kind of trip this day in the Fountain of Youth, breaking from that outside slot. The others, I think they're a little bit hard to make a case for. I know some people like Country Grammar. A word of caution about his maiden victory at Aqueduct. That was a time when kickback was really detrimental to horses closing from the back of the pack, and he was really with a speed bias that day, so I'm not so sold on Country Grammar. I'd actually slightly prefer Candy Tycoon, who breaks from the rail, and that's the only reason I'd consider him, because he really did get the best of the post position draw. This might be too tough for him, but he did improve stretching out the 2 turns on the dirt last time, so maybe he gets a small piece of this. But for me, it's mostly about Dennis's moment, and just taking a small shot against him with the number 6 as seen on TV. So that's my take on the Fountain of Youth and all of the stakes racing at Gulfstream Park on Saturday. It's a really interesting card of races. I didn't talk about it from a multi-race standpoint, but I think you can tell that a lot of these are spread races. I think you want to use many contenders in many of these early races leading up to the Fountain of Youth. I would mostly focus on my top 2 picks in the Fountain of Youth to close things out. The late pick 4, I would focus mostly on Dennis's moment and seen on TV, but hopefully I gave out some decent opinions here without Greg to help me along, because I think these were some interesting races and we took some shots with some long shots. So that's it for this week. I'll remind you, as always, that you can listen to the podcast on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcasts, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening this week, guys, and hopefully I'll be back on Tuesday with Craig to discuss and recap these races on the TimeformUS Pacecast.